So talk to me about the brain trust thing. Like, paint a picture for our listeners and for myself of what a brain trust really is.
Yeah. I mean, it boils down to like, first, it's not about rank or title. So you kind of take that off the table. That sounds a little weird, but it's basically like who owns this project, right? At the end of the day. So at Pixar, it's the director of the movie. And so you might have other VPs or presidents. They could be in the room, but the rules are they're not the ones who are going to be giving the directive of what needs to happen exactly, right? Now they're going to provide input, and that's true of whatever product or service you're building.
Startups with Stu is a podcast for anyone living or wanting to live the startup life, either as a founder or a team member. Your host, Stuart Draper, was a 9-time Inc. 5000 honoree before age 40. This show dives deep into the exhilarating world of entrepreneurship with guests that are seeking advice from Stu for their startup or business owners that want to share their entrepreneurial journey. Listeners always walk away with actionable ideas of what to do to take their startup to the moon. Startup life can feel like a roller coaster ride. And with Startups with Stu, you're likely to turn your roller coaster ride into a rocket ship ride. Get ready to uncover the secrets to startup success from visionary founders and savvy investors who've transformed groundbreaking ideas into thriving ventures.
This episode is brought to you today by PodUp. PodUp.com is the leading all-in-one AI-powered podcasting software. If you've ever considered having a podcast, want to get started, go to podup.com and check it out. I produce my podcast, use a variety of tools and producers that help me get everything done that I'm doing. Podallies.com is the agency I choose. If you're interested in having a podcast, you don't want to do it yourself through podup.com, I highly recommend that you go check out podallies.com and schedule a strategy call with one of their production specialists. They will be able to help you and think through everything you need to before you get started on your journey as a podcaster.
Good to be with you, everyone. Thank you for being with me today. And with us, we have Mr. Chris Deaver, author of Brave Together, and just an incredible man. Chris, thanks for being with me today.
Thanks, Stuart. Or Stu, it's great to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, you can call me Stuart. You can call me Stu. I get both. So, Chris, tell me about your passion for building a culture and why you think that's important for my listeners to hear.
Yeah, I think every leader, no matter what you're involved in, whether it's building a team that's small, building a company, if you're running a large company, everybody's interested in making something that's special, right? Creating magic and having an impact in the market. And culture it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's the superpower, to accomplish that. And so I'm, say bullish on culture, but on the power of co-creative cultures, especially, right? And what those can do. So yeah, that's what I'm excited about and looking forward to diving in.
You said it's the gift that keeps on giving. I love that because as an entrepreneur, as a founder, you want to build something that can keep going and growing, that can sustain itself when you're not around anymore, right? And if you're going to do that, you have to build a culture. So if you look at some of the greatest businesses today, the ones that have outlived their founders, a great example of that would be Steve Jobs with Apple. He built a culture, didn't he? So tell me more about that. In your book, Brave Together, you talk about creating brave spaces. So what is a brave space and how does that affect culture?
Yeah, I love you referenced Steve, first. He's a guy that when people would ask him, this unexpectedly, they'd say, well, what's your favorite product, right? And most people would assume, well, iPhone, that's pretty big, iPod. So he'd probably say something like that. What he would actually say is the culture. He's most proud of the culture. Why? Because it's the continual producer of the great products, right? So it's the golden goose that produces the golden eggs. It's the perpetual motion machine that continues to produce. And so, what we've seen is, and you don't have to be a Steve Jobs to do this. That's the magic of it too is he actually experienced this in other cultures first. Atari, he worked for Nolan Bushnell. There was other places that he observed this happening. And, any company, any leader in any domain, any industry you're in can actually do this.
Yeah.
And Brave Space is the path that we call Brave Space to really do this and to accomplish it. And, one example of this is Pixar. They start, we think of Pixar as it is today. It's like, well, Inside Out blockbuster movie or Inside Out 2, which is great, by the way. Highly recommend it. One of our advisors, to our work is Ed Catmull, and he started Pixar, with Steve. And he wrote a book that's incredible. It's called Creativity Inc. Highly recommend it. And, he talks a lot about his experience with Steve, and that's a whole story arc there. But the piece that's relates to this, Brave Space is he talks about brain trust. And, and really it's the power of building a team that is ego free, where you're putting building blocks on the table and you're allowing for this, the world talks about, safe space. That's good, right? Be your authentic self, but more so is creating a space where we can be brave and we can bring not just our best ideas, but we can bring together this stuff that, and start to search out in the ether, these things together that didn't exist before, right? So, we come into a meeting, you have your ideas and they're like your kids. My ideas are like my kids. And, if I care as much or more about your ideas that your kids as I do about mine, then magic's going to happen. And so this is the idea of Brave Space is if you start to create this, amazing, incredible things can happen. And I've been part of that, in tech companies. I've been part of that in places like Disney and Apple and smaller settings, right? You start doing a startup, you create a Brave Space. It's going to become a perpetual motion machine to 10x your business, but in a way that's sustainable, right? That's something that you can be proud of. That's a legacy experience.
I love this idea of brave space instead of worrying about so much about a safe space. I like that different look at it. And it sounds like you've been able to experience that within some really cool organizations. So Chris is going to share now some of his experiences from within cool companies like Apple, working on the AirPods. I want to get into that, Chris, but I want to point out to founders that you're in the trenches and you're thinking about what tactic am I going to do next that's going to help twist one dial that's going to help me make a little bit more money and help the business level up just a little bit. Don't forget that everything you're doing every day with your team as the leader is going to impact the long-term culture of your business and its ability to go and do bigger things next when you reach that next level. So you're in the trenches, you're grinding, and you're looking at what's going to take me from 100 to 200 to 1 million. And it's really hard to always remember that you're building a culture while you're doing that, taking that step. But if you don't think about it, if you're not intentional about that, you're not going to be able to do the bigger things when you reach the next level because you won't have the team that's ready, that understands, that gets it, that works well together. So, Chris, share some of your experience with AirPods. And in turn, I hope the entrepreneurs will be thinking about what this will mean for them. Maybe not today in their business, but in the future in their business.
Okay. It's good to think ahead. It's good to think a year ahead. It's good to think, what you can grow, how you can grow your business. But what you said, even more so is it's, not just thinking 1 year ahead, maybe 10 years, right? 100 years in the future, 1,000 years, right? What is the impact of this on the world, right? And people's lives. And, the experience that AirPods taught me or with AirPods at Apple was that, where teams can have debates and, what we saw actually, so I got involved in this, I'll tell the backstory, was there was actually a lot of friction. And most people don't know, even right down to the stem, right, on the original AirPods was designers were frustrated with that. They were trying to solve for how do you actually accomplish this, right? Headphones like that hadn't been created before. So they were hiring PhDs in, to the company that had written white papers about this, and they're saying this is impossible. You can't actually do this. And they're like, no, we hired you to do it. That's why, we're going to make it with you. We're actually going to create this together.
Yeah.
And, I think as you're saying, it's like, taking that long-term horizon, that longer-term view versus just today, that was the difference between, so you had teams that were trying to accomplish this, and they'd done one iteration of the AirPods, which was pretty good. I mean, it made a big splash in the market. But when we started to unpack how the teams were operating together, there were silos, and there were people there was friction. There was escalations happening. There were people that were saying, I'll never want to work with them again. Like, that was terrible. And we started to unpack what happened. And what we found was there were a lot of teams colliding. There was competition of like people throwing, information at each other in the 11th hour, right before launch, and a lot of just unnecessary friction in the system. And what we realized in unpacking this was, the organization had grown like 10x. So the other question is, like, as you grow as a company or as your team grows, how do you work together to build things, right? And to sustain that energy that you have when you're small, right? Because there's an advantage to that. But as you do grow, and as they had grown significantly, they had people, a leader that represented 10 represented 100 or 1,000 now, and so they'd show up, or their people had showed up, and you had all this kind of colliding of data, and these meetings that were happening were ad hoc instead of a planned approach. And so we asked ourselves, like, well, where have they cracked the code in this, right? Like, where's a place where, you have teams that are in rhythm, like in lockstep, and they're aligning, cross-functionally. And we found one in the camera team, and they had created a camera brain trust, like they did at Pixar. And so it was like a sister, Apple's a sister company of Pixar. So this was like something that both had done. And then we just thought, well, what if we do this with AirPods? So rather than have, these meetings that, by the way, they were 6 to 8 hour daily meetings, right? In the run up to the launch of the product, it was just constant, and that burns people out, right? It's like, that's terrible, right? So how do you change that to maybe a 1.5 hour to 2 hour meeting per week, and do that every week as a cross staff, right? We have all these functions: hardware, software, operations, design, even retail maybe, but in a meeting together, working together to resolve these things, and just have transparency and see themselves as a team. And so that was the answer. I mean, it sounds really simple, right? But in big organizations like that, they typically don't do this. And as we did, we created the AirPods Brain Trust, essentially, and it was a brave space, right? It was like this space where they could come together, they could just be in build mode. And what happens is you have products like these, AirPods Pro, that emerge that are way better. And not just that, but the rhythm is better. People are like, hey, I love working with them. I'm like, let's keep iterating, right? This is awesome. And it was something that I'd say transformed the culture, but it really took it to the next level from, thinking, we're great at thinking different. Now we're working different together. And then we applied it to iPhone, we applied it to watch, MacBook. And, these were all really, it did incredible things. And it was kind of an inside out culture shift. The head of marketing, Greg Joswiak, he goes by Jaws. They did a marketing video that's an ode to how essentially like working together, differently. And it's called Join Us Be You. They use it for recruiting at Apple, but I love that video because it expresses like this kind of connection and what it means. And for me, it was observing it, saying, zooming out, hey, any company, any person, any culture, you can be brave together, and you can create these brave spaces, and you can build a brain trust, and it's really not that hard.
So talk to me about the brain trust thing. Like, paint a picture for our listeners and for myself of what a brain trust really is.
Yeah. It boils down to, like, first, it's not about rank or title. So you kind of take that off the table. That sounds a little weird, but it's basically like, who owns this project, right? At the end of the day. So at Pixar, it's the director of the movie. And so you might have other VPs or presidents. They could be in the room, but the rules are they're not the ones who are going to be giving the directive of what needs to happen exactly, right? Now they're going to provide input, and that's true of whatever product or service you're building. Now it could be that the CEO or the founder is running point on what it is. That's fine, but creating the sense of brain trust or this brave space is about allowing for basically the best ideas to win. And how do you do this? Like, what's a simple, practical way to really get started doing this? Is you flip what's become a traditional approach. We call it the expert model, right? Where people come in and they have their expertise, and we lead with answers, and we got to have answers for everything. Well, the world is loaded with answers, and it doesn't empower people, right? If you're a leader, to just be throwing answers around. So the best approach is to lead with questions. Yeah. And this is totally counterintuitive. It sounds simple. It is, but simple is not easy all the time, right? Because it goes against part of our human nature of wanting to have answers all the time.
On something as technical as the AirPod, it seems to me like you really do need the engineer to be like, well, this is how we're going to fit it in the ear, and it's not going to jostle around and move and fall out. Like, it seems to me like there's not a lot of need for a big group of people to be ideating around something like that. So because you need very technical engineers that can run super sophisticated models, and I'm guessing they measure ear after ear after ear and get like averages for the size of the ear canal. Like, it's probably very technical, right? So
yeah.
Like, in what regards, what are they talking about? What are the ideas that they're coming up with? If that's already,
like,
so you need that level of technicality, right?
Yeah. And the technical depth, that vertical of like understanding at a fundamental level, and by the way, to your point, you have probably for every aspect of this product, the measuring, the sizing of the ear, how the antenna fits in, how each of the pieces inside of them, right? There's like these little chips that go in and everything. There's probably 1,000 white papers, right? For each of those elements. So each of these engineers, it's not just one engineer, it's like they represent an entire team of, 1,000.
Absolutely. Right.
That's like, and so it's like a movie, right? The credits roll. You got like, those, like, it's like 10 minutes of like names that are in like, 10-point font. This is a lot of people that are, combining to create something special. And so, there's a lot of complexity that goes into it. And so how does that work on a brave space or a brain trust setting? It's like, well, you have to have people that are dialed into those details, right? At a very deep level. So they understand their vertical. And but then what you're doing is amplifying the horizontal too, where you're connecting all these dots. So they're showing up. They understand that technical depth, but they're also willing to, I say make compromises, but they're willing to synthesize. So like, let's say that person, the engineering team is like, hey, well, we can't compromise, the sizing of this. It has to fit in the ear, has to do this, has to do that. Then you have software saying, well, or let's say another part of engineering, but it's like on the product side, hey, we have to have the power has to do this and this. And if we size it, we have to size it a little bigger to have the battery fit. And so there's like these,
give and take.
So this is happening constantly. Like, it's constant, and if one wins out, right? If you have too big of a battery, then it affects the sizing, and then it could affect the product altogether. And people say, oh, it's big and I don't like it, So these things are all, they have to strike this like really, it's almost like a sacred balance, right? Like that it lands on, that people understand, and that they are going to, lock into as a customer. And like, that's what they love, and it's hard.
Okay. Taking a quick break from the episode. Sorry to interrupt, but I have to take a second and thank the great team at Pod Allies that helps me produce this podcast. Startups with Stu is not an easy undertaking. It takes a lot of work and team power to get this thing done. So the team I use for my podcast, podallies.com, go check them out if you are considering a podcast. If you've thought you have a dream for a show and you want to go make it happen, go to podallies.com and book a strategy call today. I promise you won't regret it. Speaking of the show or shows, let's get back to Startups with Stu in this episode. Forgive my interruption, but if you're interested, go check out podallies.com.
So at Stu Kent, I created an interview called the culture interview. And so the last interview in the hiring process was with the CEO, myself, and I wasn't worried about whether they had skills to do the job. I let the hiring managers decide that in advance of them getting to come talk to me. And when I talked to them, it was all about the core values of our business and seeing if they were going to fit. Because what I found, Chris, was that if I hired people that could align on a set of values, then when they got in a room and they disagreed on how to solve a problem, because they already had alignment on a set of values, getting alignment on the actual best way to solve the problem came faster and easier. And I think that's what you're pointing at here, is that, you know, there's a lot of different people that come to the table with a lot of different skills, but and with a lot of different incentives to perform and be the one that gets to say, it was my battery, it was my design. And if the other engineer says, but it doesn't fit and it's not going to look good, then they have to come to an agreement. And
right.
That compromise and ability to work together as a team, you would make that or break that, I believe, at the hiring stage. Would you agree with that? Or can you do that afterwards?
It's critical. It's a critical piece of it, right? And you have to hire A players, right? That's a fundamental. That was a fundamental at Apple. And then also as a cultural kind of core value, right? You said core, and that's true, right? At the core, if there's a fundamental understanding that it's not about personal impact, like that the impact of, so the North Star is the best product, period, right? Because at the end of the day, it's also like the trade-off is simple. It's like, well, if I went out on, I have a better battery, and the trade-off is it affects the look of this thing, and then it doesn't sell as much, it doesn't land for customers, they don't love it. But if we accomplish something that people love, like they do, that they have, and well, then all these people can be proud of, right? Like, it's like, well, they're all sharing in that, you know, success story, right? The impact is like, hey, I got to be part of something. And yeah, I had to make some compromise. You know, battery wasn't quite as the innovative version I wanted, but it was the best. It was what it needed, right?
Yep.
To be successful. And that's part of the trading in ego. And we talk about this in one of our book chapters. And we reference the NBA where this happens sometimes, where, you know, you have a star who's like, and the NBA has become this marketing machine too for, you know, stars, right? Because like they get attention, they get endorsements, it all happens. But this is interesting, right? Because to your point about hiring, if you're hiring the best, well, you know, like in the NBA, these guys have been told their whole lives that they're the best generally, right? Like they play at that level, like they have been number one. And so suddenly then they arrive in, you know, at the highest level, and they're told oftentimes like, well, you're great and you're getting paid all this money, but there's this one guy, and if he plays well, then we win and we're great, right? And it actually, statistically, we've done an analysis on this, and you find that, surprisingly, this is what we call it the rock star curse, because the reality is teams actually perform better when these people are not playing. The John Morants, the James Hardens. It's like totally controversial to say this, but it shouldn't be, because it's real, right? Statistically speaking. Now, there are exceptions to this, and the exceptions happen when that person, that star, right, builds a team of stars, and when they see it that way. So when Steph Curry shows up in an interview, right, post game or pre game, and it's like, how are you going to win? Instead of saying, or yeah, we're going to win because I'm the best in the world. No, what he says is, hey, you know, Steph, or not Steph, but Clay, you know, when Clay was there, he just left. But, you know, Draymond, these guys it's a great team, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Michael Jordan, when he says about this whole GOAT thing, you know, it's like, well, people always ask me who's the greatest player of all time. And he says, wrong question. It's what's the greatest team of all time? And then he flashes his rings, you know. So, you know, that's and actually there's this beautiful moment in Last Dance, right? It's the 7th episode, I believe. And they're interviewing, you know, Michael, and he says, And this is interesting because like there was that tension between him and Steve Kerr, right? Where they actually got in a brawl, in practice. And, he held his team to a high standard. Michael did, right? No question. And I'm not going to justify all the behaviors. But what I would say is there's a moment where, and this I think gets into his soul, because we ask ourselves, what are the best core values? What is it? What is the core of winning as an entrepreneur? What is the core of winning, and ultimately winning? Because we're talking about long-term winning, right? You want to create a business that can 10X, that you can, turn into the thing that's a shared dream for you, and the people you love. And well, what he says, and it's my favorite moment in that whole series, the interviewers, like, some people said your methods are controversial, right? You got into some, scuffles of your team. And Michael's like, well, he goes, I really wanted to win. He goes, and I wanted them to want to win, to feel what it feels like to win, as a team. And then he starts to tear up, and he's like, and if people don't understand that, he's like, I don't know what to say. And he's like, just turn the camera off. Like, he gets so emotional about this, but that's his soul, right? That's his soul. Yeah. And I think if that's where your soul is, as far as your team and making it, the best it can be, then you're going to create some amazing things.
Such a great lesson to be learned there from pushing your team. I think a lot of us want to, stand back and not create drama and not create conflict. But there's a difference between conflict and contention. And what Michael did so well as a leader was create conflict that led to everyone coming out better together. And he created brave space, I believe, like you're talking about, because of that conflict. Because he let people come back at him. He let people be a part of this. We're fighting to be the best we can be, and it takes a little bit of internal fight sometimes to make that happen, and that's okay.
Yeah, and it's the rock tumbler, right? These rocks that pound against it sometimes, but it helps polish. And look at Steve Kerr. It's like, okay, and then each of these other players who became the best at what they did. He became the best 3-point shooter, right, in the league. And look at Bill Cartwright or Will Purdue. Who were they? Scottie Pippen, right? He goes to the dream team. Pippen, who's like out of 0 to one of the greatest of all time, and largely because of this influence. And that's true, and that's true in a family, right? If we we keep the expectations high, and we don't have to be abrasive about it, but if we're inspiring and if we're challenging ourselves and others, and there's a few other elements of that are amazing, which like Michael would, or MJ, he compete like in practice, like as if it's the game, right? Which is crazy, right? But that's the level of, and just taking it seriously, and being playful about it too, but like those and never expecting others to do what you're not willing to do, right? I think if we're all in, that also matters,
So Chris, this might be the most fun I've had so far on a podcast. Thank you for being with me today. We're going to keep going. I want to shift gears a little bit because we haven't talked about your entrepreneurial journey, and from everything I've gathered, you don't have a lot of I'm a traditional founder, serial entrepreneur background, but you do have some really neat experience from your time at SoulGen. Tell us about that. I think that might be something our listeners can relate to a little bit.
Yeah. So I wasn't there inside the company. What I did was I coached leaders.
Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't inside.
Got it.
And I've had other entrepreneurial experiences I can share. And I know we were talking about this earlier, but that one, what it was, I started Brave Core, and Brave Core is a leadership, consult or leadership development, consulting company of really focused on the future and about, co-creative cultures. But what we found was, as we're connecting with entrepreneurs and leaders and startups, and these are friends of mine, right, over the years that I'd known, that, they wanted to get to the next level. They wanted to accelerate their companies. They wanted to grow. And in this case, it was friends of mine. They were in this moment, and, he said, well, and I don't want to, get too much, but, we've talked, but it's like, the main point was like, hey, this company, I want my people to be more committed. I feel like, the future. And the question was like, well, if you're going to grow it they wanted to go 3x, right? So they're about 10 to 15 million, wanted to go to 45, 50 million. And, it's like, okay, that's good. And what the conversation we had was to zoom out, right? And ask ourselves, okay. And this was like coaching, or some time with those leaders to say, first it was like, hey, let's do some team building, right? Do some team building with the co-founders and that's it. And that'll solve for some things. It's like, well, that could, but what if you focus on the first principles of your future culture, right? We talk about first principles when you want to build a self-landing rocket, right? It's like, well, it's not just like throw some aluminum at it and, these other elements and that's it. What it is you got to figure out, okay, there's gravity, right? And we've got to deal with that. We have to build something that, has a certain amount of thrust and what are the first principles of your culture though? And most founders don't do this. They don't think about that. And so it was like, what if you, going back to this perpetual motion machine of culture, it's like, what if you actually build a culture that continues to create perpetual motion and it's exponential, right? You unleash your people. And so that was the coaching and the focus. They set up their first principles of their culture. They set the intention. And the intention was, we want people to we don't want them to not feel committed or be leaving. We want them to feel like they're doing the best work of their lives, that they love it here, right? And we want to grow as a company. We want to have, what most people in most companies want to have, right? As in terms of growth.
Yeah.
Fast forward a year later, so they started this journey, and we were coaching along the way with the founders. And fast forward a year later, we launched our website, Bravecore. I'm watching an NBA or a Warriors game at my house. My co-founder pings me. He's like, "Hey, you been on the website? We had just launched." And
Chris, it's bravecore.co. So
yeah, bravecore.co.
Got it.
Yeah, and the first person on our website, believe it or not, was Tim Cook, and he downloaded our ebook, signed up on our email list. So no pressure, right? To whatever you send out, it's like, okay, yeah. It was awesome. And so I actually forwarded this to that friend of mine, and we were coaching or working with Soljan, and he's like, "Hey, can I talk to you right now? Are you available?" He's like, "That's cool." He's like, "Can we talk?" And he calls me and he's like, "We just had $1 million day yesterday," right? So they went from 10 million or 15 million to 150 million in like a year, right? It was bonkers. And he goes, "Hey, this culture stuff, it's unbelievable, right? People love working here. They went public, right? They sold the company. It's an incredible story." So it wasn't inside out for me, but it was amazing because having been inside of Apple, having been inside of Disney, having been inside of, Dell, our coach Michael Dell, some of these founders,
wow,
like being in those places and in that case, like with Michael, we created $1 billion app out of almost nothing, right? And what we did was we brought people together to create Brave Space to build that. And having seen those things work on that scale at the macro level, a lot of people would be like, "Well, but I'm not Michael Dell." We're like, "Okay, but you're like these other founders, right? And if you're doing a startup, and whether it's 0 to 1 million or, 10 to 100, it's like anybody can do this."
Yeah.
Right. Anybody can do this. It's just having that mindset of, just building an incredible team of stars, not the rock star, be the team of stars,
So when you say anybody can do this, what do you really mean? Because do you believe that anybody can do it? Or is it, because I guess what you're really trying to say is anyone that dares can develop and achieve. But tell me more about how you think about it when you say that.
What I mean by that is anybody, first of all, can be a leader, and you already are a leader, right? And whether we know it or not, we are. You're a leader in your family, you're a leader in your, among your friends. Everybody's, people are looking to you, right? And so that's the start, is like, that's fundamental. But then second to that is, sometimes we think about like, well, these big names of people that have done all these things, and that's true. There was a startup I was actually a co-founder of years ago. And it was a mentoring network. It was a nonprofit, but it was one of these things. It was like, why are we doing this? It's a dream. And the intent there was just like, let's connect with all the people that we want to connect with, and let's share their story. And we did it we call it open source mentoring. We basically connected community with mentors. And these are people like not just anybody, it was like Stephen Covey, Stan Lee, who created Spider-Man, Jack Welch, who was running GE at the time, CEO. So founders and different people. And what was crazy was it was myself and some friends. It was a garage experiment. We launched it on, one day, and it was like, this turns into, over, hundreds of thousands of people in 70 different countries. We were featured in Fast Company, Entrepreneurial, magazine. But it was one of those things where I was like, look, you can have an impact. You start something, and it doesn't take much. It just takes you pursuing a dream. And if you turn it into a shared dream with a team, right, and you do that together, amazing things can happen. Now, here's the thing. The main theme of the book is this, right? It's so simple. It's like, in our lives, most of us feel fear every day, whether we know it or not, right? Subconscious or conscious. And usually there's something messy going on in our lives. It just is, right? Sometimes it's heavy, and that's even harder. But we all have this baseline of fear. And especially as entrepreneurs, you're jumping in the deep end when you're an entrepreneur, right? Where, it is, right? It's like, that's more fear, and you're signing up for it. And the world tells us, be brave. That's the way to break out of fear. And that's true. So we're brave. That helps us get out of fear. And, hustle, hacking, optimization, but there are limits to that. And what happens is it's like a clock or a watch, right? You can only dial that in so much, right? Until it's like, that's enough. But how do you get to the next level? You got to be brave together. And it's the stuff we're talking about. Jordan, look, he could only get to the playoffs before that. He could only get to the playoffs. Now he needed a team, to win. And
yeah,
that's what they did, right? In a combo, Phil Jackson, Scottie Pippen, John Paxson, Bill Cartwright, go through the whole list. But these are examples you can find anywhere. Look at U2, right? Beatles, when they broke up, before that, they were one of the best bands in the world. Then they broke up. They were never as good, right? U2, they were on the verge of breaking up. They stayed together. Their song One becomes a theme or an anthem for, doing that. And they keep it's like a rebirth of transcending time, but they're doing this together. And they pray before the concerts, but they have this sense of like, we're a team. We're in it together. It's powerful.
I love it. I have been known to thank entrepreneurs for their bravery in starting something on the podcast. And so I love that you're here today and always talking about being brave, because we live in a world that shies away a lot from the hard of starting something new. We're warned by our parents that we should get a real job. And I'm thankful for the brave ones, as Steve Jobs shared in that iconic commercial, that just the crazy ones, I think he calls them. Anyway, thank you for being with me today, Chris. Thank you for your message of being brave and creating brave spaces, being a leader that creates a positive culture. It's been an honor and privilege to have you with us today. Folks, go check out Brave Together and bravecore.co and get to know Chris better. Follow him on LinkedIn, and you won't regret it. Chris, thank you so much, man.
Thank you so much, Stu. It's been great to be here. Really love the conversation.
All right. We're going to wrap up here. And if you haven't yet, be sure to go and subscribe to additional episodes of Startups with Stu.
Hey, founders, entrepreneurs, investors, and other listeners of Startups with Stu. Thank you. thank you for listening to this episode today. As I mentioned at the beginning, as I mentioned in the middle, I want to take a second again at the end and say, if you haven't yet and you're considering a podcast, go check out podallies.com. They sure help me a lot with the show. And I am so grateful for all that they do to help me accomplish Startups with Stu and get it out to the world so we can help more founders and take your startup to the moon. Go check out podallies.com and podup.com if you're interested in podcasting at any level.
Thanks for joining me on Startups with Stu. We have big goals to help millions of entrepreneurs. If you enjoyed this show, please take a minute to share it with someone else that needs to hear it, or leave a review. Remember, success is within reach for those who dare to dream big and take action. Until next time, keep pushing forward on your entrepreneurial journey.